Hello, and welcome to the seventh episode of Meet Immigrant, my small effort to share the voices of average everyday Americans we don't typically hear from. So today's guest is Sal Abdullah. Sal was born and raised in the Central Valley of California, went to school at University of California, Santa Barbara, worked in DC, and then dove into the world of business and finance. His work brought him to Yemen, where he came face to face with him and his family's mortality. It was a pretty crazy experience. Sal, welcome. Looking forward to hearing your insights.
Thanks for having me, Jontie.
No problem, man. I like to start every show asking guests where they're from, because in America, right, we're all from somewhere else.
Sure.
So let's start there. Tell me, where's your family from? How did you guys get here? Who's the brave soul that went out on that venture to this land of coming to this land of opportunity?
Sure. So my family is originally from Yemen. My grandfather, who's actually my dad's uncle, but he adopted and raised my father, came to the U.S. in the 1950s. Nice. He was, his story, I'm not sure how much of it is myth and how much of it is reality, but he was orphaned. His father passed away before he was born, and his mother passed away by the age of 6. And sometime around, I think, like the age of 9 or 10, he made his way down to South Yemen, or Aden, which at the time was under British control. And he spent his teenage years there, and then eventually made it out of Yemen. I know a bit of the story here. This part is fragmented. I know he spent time in Ethiopia and time in Madagascar, but eventually made his way to Buffalo, New York. And then from Buffalo, New York, he only spent a really small amount of time there, and went to the Central Valley in California, where he landed there and started picking grapes in the Central Valley, and built himself up from there.
So that was 1950s, you said, right?
1950s, yeah.
Wow. So what was that like? I mean, were there other Yemenis? Was there an Arab community that he could connect with, or was he kind of like alone?
Yeah, interestingly enough, if you there was a lot of Yemeni migrant workers, or immigrants, I should say, working in the Central Valley picking grapes. They were working side by side with a lot of Mexican laborers, and this happened to his time in the Central Valley and picking grapes happened to coincide with the time that Cesar Chavez and the labor movement was active in the Central Valley, and it's a little known story, kind of not known really outside of small circles, that Yemenis were really involved in the labor movement in the Central Valley.
Wow. That's interesting. Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah.
That's incredible, man. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
So your uncle, did he spend the rest of his life in the fields? Was he able to get out? Like what? Yeah.
So he was a born entrepreneur. If you hear his stories, even when he was in South Aden, he bought himself a car, and instead of using it, ended up renting it out while he was also working on the docks. Wow. So he, within about a year, really started building something. He was working in the fields. He rented a restaurant that only opened in the evening, and it only served basically the laborers from the camps. But he continued to work in the fields in the day, run the restaurant at night, serving them food, and then he would sleep in the restaurant to save on rent. Wow. And you can imagine being a penny pincher and a hard worker. He saved up money pretty quickly and bought a business in Modesto, California, I believe it was. And from there, built himself a life, then married my grandmother and brought her from Yemen, and then started a second business and a third, and eventually built a successful little collection of stores and restaurants.
Wow, incredible. Wow. Yeah. And so this guy was like inventing Turo in Yemen back in the probably 40s.
Basically, he was the first Yemeni Uber driver. He's an extremely hard worker. He really was kind of like the founding patriarch of the family here in the U.S. and brought a lot of people over to the U.S. And so a lot of they would say, like, if you were to look at the tree of people that are here now, there's probably 50 to 100 people who can trace their origin story in the United States to him. So he really was that seed that started it all.
Incredible. And so, I remember you were telling me that your parents, weren't actually born and raised here. They were also born and raised in Yemen. Is that right?
Yeah, so my father was born in Yemen, and then he, at a very young age, migrated to southern Yemen, again, Aden, that was under
Okay.
control of the British at the time. And then my grandfather brought him over to the US, probably somewhere between age 7 and 9. I
Oh
always
wow,
lose the
he's pretty
detail
young.
of the story.
Okay.
And so he came to the US at a pretty young age and worked alongside my grandfather, running the store, kind of, similar to all immigrant families. Kids are put to work, right? My mother has a little bit of a different story. Her father was a Yemeni as well, Yemeni merchant, who left Yemen probably in the 1940s, 1950s, really young age, and actually
Mhm.
spent 50 years of his life, never went back to Yemen until he was much older, in Ethiopia. And
Wow.
built again, like a lot at that time, there was a lot of Yemenis in Eastern Africa, everywhere from Somalia uh, to Sudan, Kenya, and Ethiopia was probably the biggest hub for them. And he built up a business there, lived a very good life. He was very well to do until the government, the military in Ethiopia overthrew the emperor of Ethiopia, Haile
Wow.
Selassie, and then a communist regime took over and basically pushed out any of the wealthy immigrants that were in the country at the time.
It's a very common story we hear.
It
My
is. It is.
sister-in-law too
It
had to
is.
leave Vietnam. Her family had to leave Vietnam, lost all their wealth. It's
Yeah.
it's crazy.
It,
But so tell me, like, it's interesting. I kind of have a very basic knowledge of Yemen. I do remember there's like trade and business is very important to the Yemeni, economy, and the cult becomes part of the culture.
sure.
So, do you see that? Like, I know like there's trade with Africa and of course the Middle East and even India and Asia. Do you see that in the culture, like the cuisine and like how the people act, and have they kind of taken these elements from other cultures and kind of incorporated into their own? Have you seen that?
Absolutely. The food is great. I'm a little biased here. I'm going to say it's probably one of the better Middle Eastern cuisines. And it actually differs from region to region. It's quite unique,
Okay.
actually. So if you look at the north, you can see the Turkish influence, a lot of
Hmm,
like yogurts and milks and honey in the dishes.
interesting.
The south is much more Indian and African for a variety of reasons, both because of the trading. There's a lot of seaports in the south, people traveling to either Southeast Asia or to Eastern Africa.
Mm,
But then there's also the British, right? They brought a large Indian contingent. A lot of laborers came to southern Yemen, and because of that, like there's a lot of Indian influence in our food. So depending on the region that you're at, there's a good amount of foreign influences.
that's awesome. And it just enriches the society, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
incredible.
And it's layer
Um,
by layer. What's interesting too is like, it's not a century's worth of history, it's literally millennia's worth of history.
yeah,
Like the
yeah.
story of how Southeast Asia became Muslim. Like if you're thinking about India and, sorry, not India, Malaysia and Indonesia,
Mhm.
it was the Hadrami merchants Hadramaut is a region in Yemen,
Yep.
very steeped in its own history, and it's kind of a unique region that's almost kind of its own thing.
Mhm.
But it's pretty well documented that they're the ones who, through the trade routes and basically converted a lot of what you see in
Wow.
Southeast Asia into Islam.
Wow, that's a crazy history. I know it's an area we don't really know much about either. I think
Yeah,
we really haven't studied that, but it's very rich and yeah, incredible the effects it's had on history, right?
yeah,
And yeah.
yeah.
Um, so that's fascinating background. So your parents, grew up there and then made their way to America via your grand uncle, right? Your
hmm
grandfather.
hmm
And where did so did they go directly to California and settle there? And like, what did they do when they came? Or did they work in his shops? Did they start their own business? What was that
Yeah,
like?
so they all came to California, and basically it was kind of like one big happy family working in a couple of shops together. My dad really likes kind of the area that we grew up in. My mom absolutely hates it. It's just given the different backgrounds. My mom was a little, I guess, aristocratic in her tastes, given her dad was very well to do. My dad was much more blue collar. But they all participated in the family
Nice.
business. I grew up working in the store, and it's only in 2018 that we actually sold the family business after
Wow.
everybody grew up, went to college, and no one wanted to work in it anymore. But yeah, it basically we ran it for almost 60 years.
That's beautiful. And it's very
Yeah.
common too, you know. I mean, I remember hearing a story. It was Singapore, but the same thing
Mhm.
happened, right? You have all these, you know, new immigrants who start these food stalls, incredible cuisine from around the world. And but the idea being that they're going to give their kids the opportunity that they didn't have, right? And unfortunately, what that means
Absolutely.
is as they retire, there's nobody there to replace them because the kids found better
Absolutely.
opportunities. And then you lose a bit of that culture. You lose a bit of that, you know, and so was that, you know, that it's just it's a beautiful thing that you guys, you know, the kids were able to get out and do,
Mhm.
you know, bigger and better things. But it's a shame that the community loses that over time, you know, loses that
It,
kind of those mom and pop shops, the unique atmosphere. And how
yeah.
did you guys feel? Like, did you so was there a place for you? You know, like you said, like, you know, back in the 50s, the Yemenis were a big part of, you know, the labor movement in the Central Valley. Did that continue on? Like, so when you were growing up, was there still that Yemeni presence? You know, how did you fit in with the rest of the community there?
That's an interesting question. So, a good portion of the Yemeni community pivoted from being migrant laborers in the fields to small business owners.
Hmm.
And it was kind of the classic immigrant story. One guy opens up a store, helps three or four other guys, and they in turn help a bunch of other people. But the way that evolved was very interesting in that the Yemeni community never left the Central Valley. So typically, like the people who were in the Central Valley have continued to be in the Central Valley for generation after generation. So
Huh.
what you found is like this interesting hybrid between like or interesting interaction between the Mexican community and the Yemeni community. Like my dad's store, for example, inside the store we had a taqueria, right? I'm fluent in Spanish,
Wow.
and so you almost feel like we're almost honorary members of the larger community. But I knew growing up like people had a hard time pinpointing where we were from. Like there was assumptions that we were Portuguese because we
Oh,
spoke Spanish, and or so we had all kinds of different uh, uh, um, I guess
people.
speculation about where our origins were from. But for the most part, we fit right in.
Cool.
You know, and I guess you know, with time comes familiarity. So if you're there for 30 or 40 years, you know, people don't might not necessarily know about your exotic origins. They just know that you've been in the town for 40 years and you're just accepted for what you are.
That's great. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
So, and you know, you were definitely even a bigger part of the community. I remember seeing on Facebook, like you had pictures of yourself in front of a fire truck. You were a volunteer fighter, right?
I was for 5 years.
Wow. So what
I
motivated that? Where did that come from? That's an interesting thing. I never
so I
would
wish I could say like uh,
something
something like
profound.
you know, public service, or I wanted to serve the community. But to be honest, I was young. I thought the idea of lights and sirens and walkie talkies was going to be fun. Obviously, like you join for like those simplistic reasons as a kid,
Yeah.
but as you grow up, like you realize like, oh no, it is more serious. You are doing
Mhm.
a public service and things like that. So
True.
I would say the motivation was pretty, you know, straightforward. In that, like I just thought it was cool. Always wanted to do it,
Awesome.
and it was fun. It was a lot of fun. You get to, especially when you're serving your community, right?
Yeah.
You show up on a house fire, you know the owner of the house. You show up on a medical, you
Wow.
know and so there is a very very good feeling of
That's awesome. That's
accomplishment
awesome.
when you do something like that.
It's beautiful. No, it definitely connects you to the community, like you said, you know,
Yeah,
and in a moment where they really need you, you know, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
life or death in many of those circumstances.
yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, you grew up in the Central Valley. Did you ever go back to Yemen? Did you and your family ever travel back? What was that
So
like?
yeah, I've spent a couple segments of my life in Yemen. I went in when I was 14 because my Arabic was getting very bad, and so my parents was like, "Okay, let's go
You need a
spend
refresher course.
a refresher course, basically." Which and I so I went to an international school so that I can
Oh,
continue my like U.S. studies as
wow.
well as study Arabic, and that's actually where I met my wife, believe it or not. And
Wow.
we were only 14 or 15 at the time.
Wow.
We didn't get married at 14 or 15. But we stayed in touch over the years, and when she came to school in Canada, we got back in touch, and
That's
then
awesome.
things went from there. Um, I also went back in 2013, which was kind of the weirdest career pivot for me
And we will
because
get to that. I don't want to spoil
are you going
the
to
I don't want
okay,
to spoil
you
the
got it.
climax.
You
No,
got it. You
but
got
that's yeah, we'll have to get back to that. So that's interesting.
it.
So when you did go back in when you were 13, 14, right? 14, 15?
14, 13.
14. Um, What was that experience like? Was there a culture shock? Or like, what are these people doing? Or
Yeah.
was it like, oh, this is just like, how I was raised in America? Like, what was that
No,
like?
no, definitely not. So, if people who've been to the Middle East, like if you've been to Egypt, if you've been to Dubai, there's a lot of familiar sites, right? You
Yeah.
can go to TGIF Fridays in any one of those countries. Yemen was,
No.
you're not going to find a TGIF Friday. Let's just say that. If you look at the history of Yemen, right, recent history, northern Yemen was cut off from the rest of the world until like the late 1960s. Yemen used to be ruled by a Zaydi imam. That's basically their king. And he was like really against allowing any outside influences to come into the country. So it was ruled like this medieval kingdom cut off from the rest of the world. And that really has spilled over even to this moment. And so when I went, it was literally like the land that time forgot. Cars, sure, electricity, sure, but everything else it was pretty distinct. And this was before the influence of the internet was really prevalent, and so they were really, everything to them was foreign. I would say if you go back now, people are exposed to TV and exposed to the internet. Everybody has WhatsApp and Facebook on their phones, so they see what the outside world was like. At that time, it wasn't like that at all.
So what was good about that? And what did you like the best about that? What did you like the least about that?
Great question. So at first I hated it completely. And if you think about the age, like at the age of 14,
exactly.
What you want movie theaters, you want malls, you want things that are shiny and nice. And Yemen is none of that. But probably 4 or 5 months in, it almost hit like a ton of bricks that I love this place.
Wow.
Because one of the ways that you can kind of live a happy life is even if you're living the most mundane life, it's like mythologizing your life, right? When I was in Yemen, 4 or 5 months in, I realized like this place is actually quite interesting. Like this is not a museum. This is lived history. Like there's the old part of Sana'a is called Bab el Yemen, and it literally looks like the town surrounding the palace in Aladdin, where all the houses are right next to each other, and you can jump from roof to roof.
Wow.
And really, really amazing buildings, but it's not this thing where you observe it from a mile away. People are living there. There's motorcycles between the streets, food vendors, yelling, noise, sounds, and after a while, it's like I feel like I'm Indiana Jones, like on this pretty interesting journey. And so, probably 4 or 5 months in, I really started to love the place. Started to love the food, the people, the sounds, the sights, and probably after that, I was like, I don't want to go back to the U.S.
That's incredible.
That's how interesting I found it, because I just felt like I was living an interesting life.
And I think that's beautiful. This is what I love about kind of speaking to people who have backgrounds from different countries, right? We in America, we kind of tend to get spoiled with our standard of living. I think if I went to Yemen, I would have the same reaction. Like, I can't take this place. It's not clean enough. There is all this shiny new stuff, right? But at the same time, like, when you go to a different area of the world, there's a different perspective. There's a different way of living. It kind of questions your assumptions on like, how should one live life, right? And, I think even like I've asked my cousins who grew up in Syria, and I asked them like, well, where do you prefer? Like, actually, they prefer Syria. Why? It's not like they have all the new shiny stuff either, but like, well, you have time. You sit with family. Like, there's those connections that somehow we lose here in the West.
Absolutely.
So thanks for sharing that. And then we can go into a lot of other things. Like, you had, experiences in college in Santa Barbara, right? You went to DC and worked for the whole political apparatus there. And, there's all sorts of stories we can go into, your aspirations for law school, how you ended up, in finance. But I think we all really want to hear about that story. It's fascinating because most of us have never been bombed. Thank God. And thank God your family made it out without any problems. But there's some real serious things still going on in Yemen. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to chat with you, because it's something I didn't know much about. So could you take us to, you moved to Yemen, I think 2013, you said, right?
2013.
What brought you there? And how is that transition to living back in Yemen?
So there was a variety of things pulling me there. Number one, if I had not gone to Yemen, I was going to delay my marriage by at least a year because my wife was still waiting for her visa to come to the U.S.
Okay.
That was number one. She had finished her undergrad in Canada and then went to Yemen to work there until we were to get married and come back to the U.S. Number two was the fact that you don't make money in politics, and my family's business was not doing so well, and I needed to step up and help family and do different things. So,
Gotcha.
I was working at the time at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. It's like a subcomponent of the DNC, which basically it's the side of the Democratic Party that focuses on getting people elected to Congress rather than the presidency.
Gotcha.
And the pay was horrible there, and it tends to be this: people give up pay for prestige to work on Capitol Hill. I think like the entry level salary for a staff assistant in the U.S. Senate is like $24,000. So people tend to have like some form of subsidy in the sense that their parents are well to do or something like that. So it wasn't a place to be for somebody who didn't come from that kind of background.
Gotcha.
And so a variety of things came together, and I was like, I can probably do something interesting and make some good money, have an interesting story for when I put together my law school applications. So let me go to Yemen. Right? It sounds like a perfectly rational decision, which it's not. So I went there without a job. Had a couple of things, but they fell through. But within like a month or two, I got lucky and landed a head of finance job at an oil and gas company.
Wow.
Which no finance background is really interesting. But there was this wild cowboy. Basically spent most of his life in, I think, like Montana and Texas and in different parts of the world. He started as a roughneck in the oil fields and worked his way up to a country manager, I think in Saudi Arabia, also in India. And he just looked at my resume and he's like, I need a guy like you who can speak the language. And, and he was a little like a shoot from the hip kind of guy. And he's like, finance, you can learn it on the job. I just need a guy who I can trust. And I was like, okay. So he gave me this job with a bunch of responsibility, and they were in the process of purchasing the assets to operate an oil and gas company. So we went from being like 3 to 4 expatriates, like a Canadian, a guy from Norway, a guy from the UK, and a guy from Australia, and me, to almost 300 people overnight. Wow. And all of a sudden now I have this giant responsibility. It was extremely stressful, and within a year, like I had left that place.
Wow.
But I had a job lined up, thank God, and that was to be a deputy CFO of a cable TV company, and I helped launch that company in the country. It was a really interesting project, but then unfortunately, things started to unwind politically in the country, and that's kind of phase 2 of the story. I don't know how far you want me to get ahead.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So tell me, so this at this point, this is where the civil war breaks out. The Houthis, enter the capital, et cetera. Maybe a little background. I think a lot of us don't really understand, okay, why is there this war happening in the first place?
Sure.
So do you understand that? Do you, can you shed some light for us?
I'm going to try to be as concise as possible because it's a long story. So there's a few kind of components because there's more than one fracture line, right? There's the internal differences in the north and the elites of the north of the country. And there's also the differences between the north and the south, which is also another fracture line. And then you have the whole Saudi Arabia, Iran proxy thing going on. There was a president, his name was Ali Abdullah Saleh, who ruled the country for over 30 years. He had united Yemen first peacefully, and then when they tried to break off through a civil war, kept Yemen together. And so the elites in the north really started dominating the south. So that's one aspect of the conflict. Internally, the elites had this kind of like power sharing agreement between the tribal powers, the military powers, and the political power, which was kind of manifested itself in Ali Abdullah Saleh. The original cohort of rulers got along. It was kind of a tense arrangement, but they got along. But when the next generation came into power, the fracture lines started showing up. They did not feel obliged to kind of keep the power, keep the equilibrium in place. And so there started to be competition between the elite factions within the country. And then the Arab Spring came along, and the couple of factions used that as an opportunity to push out Ali Abdullah Saleh. Once they pushed out Ali Abdullah Saleh, he started working to get his revenge. And he used he used this movement in the north called the Houthi movement, which is kind of a religious revivalist movement of the Zaydis. The Zaydis are like a very Sunni-like Shia that are only really found in Yemen. Like they're the closest to Sunnah amongst the Shia. And so there was never this kind of like religious tension between people in Yemen. But, you introduce a few things and civil strife and like backing from Iran and Saudi Arabia backing other factions. All of a sudden it took on like a religious dimension, right?
Yeah.
And so he basically helped the Houthis take over the capital in September of 2014, right?
And you were there.
I was there. And so I was there. I remember driving from Sana'a to Hodeidah, which is probably the most beautiful drive I've ever taken in my life. Wow. And it was right before they invaded the capital, and I was driving outside of Sana'a, and then as soon as I get to the outskirts of the city, there was an encampment of thousands of Houthis waiting to invade the capital. But I go right through it. And they're extremely polite, because what they were trying to do is win over the people. Like it was gonna be this kind of thing where it doesn't look like a takeover of the capital, but really it is.
So was there any warning? I mean, was that the first thing? Like, oh my God, what's going on? Or you were like, oh, this is happening.
They were consolidated. They were taking over cities left and right in the north, leading up to the capital.
Gotcha.
And it was a slow game, and it was a really we had a really incompetent interim president, and I think he thought that the Houthis could also help him to get rid of some parties that he wasn't really happy with, like the Islah Party, which is like the affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen. And he didn't get along with the Islah, so he felt like they were going to come in. The Houthis had beef with the Islah. So he thought they were going to come in, knock off the Islah, and leave. He was an idiot. There's no other way to put it. So they took down the Islah. That was the first thing that they did, but then they put him on house arrest right afterwards.
Yep.
So his calculus was extremely hard.
Bad political calculus right there.
Yeah, exactly. And so...
So how was it for you guys? So the average person, somebody like you, did you feel threatened when this happened? I mean... What were you thinking?
It feels threatened in the sense that Yemen is a small country and everybody knows everybody, right? And so it's not really weird in Yemen for somebody who's like a lower middle class to know a government minister or a major general, right?
Gotcha.
So in fact, that's one of the more beautiful things that I noticed about Yemen is like you can have like a $2 million house next to a tent, and like and there's no. No, of course, there's a hierarchy within any society, but there's also like it's not unheard of to get access to these kind of people, even if you're not somebody significant. Wow. So knowing that, you hear of people getting knocked off, right? Like, oh, this guy who was Sal Abdullah Saleh's like personal assistant or cameraman, his house got raided and they threw out his kids from the house and things like that. So there was that sense, like you hear like through 1 or 2 degrees of separation about bad things happening, but I guess the average person wasn't feeling it. Now you were feeling it. The one thing that did change is like the checkpoints in the city went from being checkpoints manned by soldiers in official uniforms to just like a random militia manning the checkpoint.
So was there fighting between the government forces and these? I mean, was there gunfire happening, bombings?
There was, but it was minor skirmishes, and a lot of different components of the military sensed what was happening. They're like, we're not, we don't know who's who. Like, we don't know which sides of the military are loyal to the current president, the former president, the Houthis. So we're not going to put out our neck. So basically what ended up happening is anytime the Houthis showed up at a military camp or to take over a ministry, it just kind of fell. Like there was no real strong resistance because no one was going to sacrifice themselves for a really kind of like a inter-elite fighting.
I love that. I wish most wars happened that way. It's like, look, this fight is between you guys. We have nothing to do with it, right?
No, well, so this is just purely to take over the capital. Now, but the fighting did get really intense when they went to go move down to Taiz and Aden. It's a different story because in the capital, again, it's where all the elites were. And so people are not going to fight, for the elites to maintain, like, I don't care if this guy's son maintains control of this ministry. Why am I going to kill myself, right? But when they try to take over, different portions of the country. Now people were fighting for their homeland. They were fighting for their city. They were fighting for their way of life.
Gotcha.
And so it got intense when they moved towards Taiz, towards Aden, and that was a lot more carnage there.
So what decision did you guys make? You're gonna
we were, it's funny how people make decisions. You always hear about World War II and people who stuck around for dumb reasons, right? Like, oh, I need to wrap up my business. Meanwhile, the Nazis are coming into town. And it was the same kind of thing. We were making decisions based on like, well, let's get, let's sell our car, get my last paycheck, and then we'll leave the country. And not realizing like how bad things could get. And so we stuck around between September and the end of the year.
Okay.
And then we evacuated the same night that Hadi, who was the interim president at the time, was put under house arrest. That was sometime in January. So we left to Egypt. And we stuck around in Egypt, and we went to the U.S. Embassy, tried to get like my wife's visa expedited. It wasn't happening. And then we said, all right, let's go back to Yemen in a month and we'll wrap things up. So we were stupid 2 times, not once.
Well, I think this is why it's valuable. If any of us is ever caught in a third world civil war, or maybe one here, who knows? But this is this could come in use.
Well, I mean, at the time, it didn't feel like a civil war, right? It was like a change of guard. And by the way, they hadn't moved to the south, so this was before things got bad. They had just taken over the capital.
Okay.
I didn't think about it. I do think it was really dumb now when I look back at it, but I was 26, 27 at the time, so I give myself a little bit of.
And what were your parents telling you? Were they like,
get out? My mom was like literally sick, like come back home, don't stay there anymore. So we said, all right, we'll go back, we'll wrap up things and we'll leave.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we went back sometime, I believe it was February. And then things got bad. And then they wanted the Houthis were firmly in control in the capital. Now they wanted to consolidate control of the country. Hadi had escaped house arrest and went down to the south.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, I believe the way he escaped was dressing like a woman and making it out just right past the guards, which is really funny.
This is like a great comedy show.
It is a great comedy. So Hadi is an idiot, but he has a knack for survival. That's the one thing that he does have. Like he knows how to preserve himself. He was I believe a general in South Yemen when it was run by communists, and he survived like the bloodbath in the south and made it to the north. And so this guy he's a survivor.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Reminds me, I don't know if you ever watched Battlestar Galactica. There's a guy, Gaius Baltar. Like, it totally reminds me of Gaius Baltar.
Yeah, I'm a Star Trek fan myself. So
I think Star Trek was the equivalent.
The Ferengi guy who runs the bomber at Deep Space Nine. Like, it doesn't matter who's in power, he's just serving his drinks.
I can see that.
So when he escaped, they knew that by him going and establishing the presence of the government in the south, they would lose their legitimacy in the north. So they started moving against the south. Saudi Arabia and the rest of the GCC countries consider that like a red line, like don't cross this red line. And the Houthis didn't take it seriously. They never thought Saudi Arabia has really never fought an offensive war. And I believe it was either late March or April, the bombing campaign started against the Houthis.
And you were there again.
I was literally in the worst spot you can be. If you look up the explosion, it's in an area called Jatan, and it looked like the explosion that you saw in Lebanon. They actually hit like a Scud missile site and blew the entire top of a mountain off. It destroyed my office, destroyed my apartment. Luckily, I was already gone by that time. It was only like a week after I had left. But things got really bad, and for a couple of weeks there, we were hiding in basements, trying to get out of the country, but there was no flights, there was no transportation, no fuel. So it was a bad couple of weeks there.
So whose basements are you hiding in? Are these family members, friends?
Family members. Yep. Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And so what is that like? I mean, honestly, I think the vast majority of us have not had that experience. What's going through your mind as you're sitting in this basement, you're hearing bombs going off, you're like, what are you thinking we might not live through this? Or you're like, no, we'll be okay. I mean,
definitely. What's interesting is it wasn't the thought of death that was a scary thing, or it's not the obviously it's scary, and obviously it crossed my mind like that was not a good situation to be in. But the most raw emotion that I feel that I can still recall and feel right now is a sense of being trapped.
Mm.
Like
Got
you know you're in danger, you know some bad things are happening around you, and you're trapped, and you feel like you can't move.
it.
And that was the worst feeling.
And how
Um,
about how old was your kid at this point?
my kid was not born.
Oh,
He was
okay. So
my
just you
kid
and your
was
wife.
born, yeah. That's kind of a later part of the story, but it was just me and my wife at the time. Thank God.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Um,
Well, thank God. I
and
mean, I think that would be really terrifying for
yeah,
a child. I
yeah,
mean,
absolutely. Thank God he wasn't born at the time.
oh. So what did you do? I mean, did you go to the U.S. Embassy?
There was no help coming from the U.S. Like you would get messages. You was like a email sign up, and you would get messages that were very generic. Like,
It's
um,
like, try-
yeah, it was
what was the
basically trying to make
recommendation?
your way out of the country as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And the one of the messages I remember getting was like, there's a French naval vessel off the coast of, I don't know, Hodeida or Mocha or Aden. Try to make your way to the French naval vessel, like literally like rent a skiff and try to go out 3 or 4 miles and get on board. But there was messages constantly being sent out about like different opportunities to escape, but it was basically very clear that no one was coming to get us. And Yemen has, I think, like 50,000 American citizens living in the country. So
Wow.
there was quite a bit of people there. There's a lot of Yemeni Americans.
Wow.
But eventually, there was a couple, there was flights going on. They weren't commercial flights. There was zero commercial flights, but they were
Okay.
flights. There was several flights, some organized by the Russian government, some organized by uh, I believe it's called the International Organization for Migration. It's part of the UN, and then the Indian government, because there was a lot of Indian nationals in the country. So we got out with the Indian government. They were courteous enough to allow us.
Wow.
They allowed foreign nationals to board the flights, even if you weren't Indian. And so on every flight, there was like 20, 30 seats for non-Indians to get out of the
Wow.
country. And we had spent 2 days at the airport. We had to bribe people to get past, because like, not because I wanted to cut in line, because everybody was cutting in line in front of us. Basically, if you didn't bribe, you didn't get out.
Wow.
And so it was pretty dramatic. We ran on the tarmac. There was no ticketing, no nothing. Like it literally, you get on a bus, you run up to the airplane. The airplane's on the ground for 10 minutes, and you're off.
Wow.
And,
Wow.
and so they flew us out to Djibouti, and from
Okay.
Djibouti, you were free to go wherever you wanted to go. And we caught the first flight out to Ethiopia, and spent a
Okay.
few months in Ethiopia trying to get my wife's papers in order.
Wow. Because yeah, your wife is not a citizen, not a U.S. citizen at
She
this
is
point, huh?
now. She is
She's now,
now.
but I didn't back
At
then.
that point, she was not a U.S. citizen. And she had given up her Canadian residency because she was like, okay, I just finished my undergrad.
Yeah.
I'm going to spend a year in Yemen, and I'm going to get married and move to the U.S. So there was never, no one kind of
Thought about.
foresaw this. And when these kind of things happen, Saudi Arabia and the GCC did a really good job of making sure that Yemenis couldn't go anywhere.
Why?
It was part of a pressure campaign. So like countries that would normally love to have Yemenis come visit, like Egypt and different other countries, all of a sudden were making it very hard to get a visa into the country.
Wow.
Yeah.
So where did you guys end up then? Like,
So Ethiopia, and then from Ethiopia we went to Jordan,
okay.
and Jordan is where my son was born.
Oh, nice.
And
So
then
was your wife pregnant while you guys were in Yemen?
in Ethiopia.
No. Oh, in Ethiopia. She was
In
okay.
Ethiopia. Yeah, and then
Okay.
we got out to Jordan, and then he was born in Jordan, and then he waited
Wow.
like probably the first 6, 7 months of his. And it took him like 9 months. So it ended up taking like a lot longer than we thought. It was like 2 years to get her, almost 2 years to get her visa.
Wow.
And the U.S. government did not make it easy. Like it was extremely hard. Like they would tell you things like, we only process Yemeni visas in Algeria. Well, we're in Ethiopia and we can't get a visa to Algeria. So how am I going to go get my? So it was a lot of and I had letters. I had people. I reached out to like congressional contacts,
Oh, that's right.
letters
You were in
from
DC.
multiple
Yeah.
congressional offices to help. It didn't
Cool.
help. And I think to myself now, like I'm relatively educated, have more connections than like an average Yemeni American who just came to this country does.
Hmm.
And I used every single connection that I had, and it still took 2 years to get my wife into the country. So I
Wow.
can't even imagine. Like I know people who took much, much longer than that.
Wow. Well, thank God everything worked out for you guys, but I know that's quite the ordeal.
Yeah.
So any lasting effects? I mean, for you and your wife, I mean, you guys still kind of traumatized by that or able to move on? Um, you know?
What's interesting is it comes up every like I'm not necessarily convinced by like kind of I don't know the best term that I would say is modern psychology in the sense like that I'm like I wouldn't give a technical definition of how I feel basically, but I do think that when something like that happens to you, it becomes permanently part of you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it manifests itself in different ways. It manifests itself in different ways. I'd say we're good. Like yeah, I think faith has to do a large
Mm,
part of like how we've recovered and how we've done. But what I do remember for me, maybe as like a father, as a husband, as a provider, is a sense of like 2.5 years of feeling like you can't do anything for your family.
wow.
That's a horrible feeling.
It is. It
And
is.
so and basically because I spent over a year and a half overseas, jumping from country to country, living in hotels or apartments or different things like that, and not really being able to work because you can't take a job here if you have to hop back every week to Jordan, right?
Yeah.
So financially, it destroyed us. Like a year and a half of, I was 26,
Yeah.
20, when I left Yemen, I was 27, 28. I had done okay for myself, but at 28, you don't have $2 million saved up, right?
No.
It wiped
No.
us out financially. So I started from
Wow.
zero at like
Wow.
28, 29. So
Wow.
yeah,
That's incredible.
yeah,
But how about your perspective? Like, having a life experience like that, you said, it's always going to be with you. I'm sure how you look at the life and the world has also changed. Like,
absolutely, absolutely.
so can you share that, that kind of
Yeah.
those insights that you've kind of gained from this experience?
Yeah, so I definitely have more empathy for immigrants. Immigrants, and I see like people coming to this country at 45 with 3 kids. And like
Yeah.
what it must feel like to start fresh in a new country at that age. Like I definitely have a strong
Empathy.
affinity to those type of people now.
Wow.
The other thing is just like the sense of like hopelessness, right? You really get a sense of I think tasting hopelessness gives you perspective and really makes you understand that like your life is not in your hands as much as you think it is, right? It's in your hands in terms of what you can do within the confines of or certain parameters of your life, right? Like if you have a decent family and you have access to college and yeah, you can control parameters that lead to like a relatively decent life. But
Mhm.
um, Warren Buffett says like if I was born in sub-Saharan Africa, my ability to allocate capital would be useless, right?
Yeah.
And so,
True.
like seeing how things like I was a deputy CFO when the war started. Um,
Yeah.
the war starts, all of a sudden, like you're nothing. People
Wow.
don't pick up your phone calls because everybody thinks you want something from them, right? Like so, it changes your perspective on how the world operates, and
Yeah.
so like now I guess I'm suspicious uh, of anything being permanent, I guess is the best way. Like,
Gotcha.
I live more day to day. I don't necessarily plan for 20 years ahead because you may not have those 20 years.
Wow.
And I think one last thing that I'd like to say is like, people in tough situations don't necessarily fit the image of what you imagine them to look like. So I remember someone I randomly had a person I met in DC when I was on the subway. She was a German tourist, and I passed my business card to her if she wanted a tour of the capital. She added me on Facebook, and it turns out she was like very anti-immigrant and all kinds of things. Interesting enough, and I saw her post one day and it showed a picture of an immigrant coming into Europe. This was like during the immigrant crisis from Syria. This was
Yep.
and she was highlighting how the immigrants had iPhones and how that was proof that they weren't as desperate as you thought they were. And I was like,
You can have an iPhone, but
yeah. So when I was stuck a year and a half with no income, like, you
yeah.
sure I had, nice luggage and nice shoes and laptops and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't mean my situation wasn't rapidly deteriorating, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so basically,
It's a very
I have it.
oversimplified.
Yeah. Don't think like there's people who may look solidly middle class or even upper middle class who are really in a tough situation. So
Yeah.
it's not always the image of impoverishment or desperation that you always imagine.
No, it's true here in this country as well, right?
Hmm.
I mean, people are doing well because they have a job. They lose their job. Well, that middle class, even upper middle class lifestyle could disappear in months,
Yeah, exactly.
you know?
Yeah,
So it's,
yeah,
it's a very good point.
yeah.
And what about the rest of your family? So, I mean, you've gotten out, but the war has continued, right? And, like you said, the proxy war between Iran and the
Yeah.
GCC has continued. So how's your family faring? Like, are you in touch with them? Like, what are they
Yeah,
saying?
yeah,
What's going
definitely.
on?
So the bulk of my family has scattered all over the world.
Wow.
Um,
So they've also gotten out then.
they've gone out. So I have a lot of family in Egypt.
Okay.
Um, I have cousins now studying in Eastern Europe. There was a family who also had citizenships in other countries prior to this. So Canada, UK, Australia. People are all over the place now, and I doubt that it will ever go back to us being in a single place again.
Wow. I mean, I see it with my own family. Like,
Yeah.
they left the Caucasus, our homeland,
Mhm.
in the late 1800s, fled into
Mhm.
the Middle East, and then now, with the Syrian civil war, those people who settled there have also gotten scattered again,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Some in Europe, some went back to the homeland in
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Caucasus. It's and like you said,
Yeah.
it's you're starting over each time,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and it's the same story with my family where they've scattered two or three times now.
Wow.
Both sides of the family, interestingly enough. So my wife's side, my wife's maternal side of the family, or um, they lost everything when the communists took over in southern Yemen and they migrated to the north, and they built a very comfortable and good life for them, and then
Hmm.
this thing struck, and now they're starting over again in Egypt. On my mom's side, as I mentioned earlier, they were in Ethiopia, went to Yemen. Now they've left Yemen. So yeah, it scatters families. It breaks ties permanently, um, because eventually 20 years from now, the clan in Egypt is going to be separate from the clan in Czechoslovakia, right?
True.
And you're
True.
never going to bring those two clans back together again.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah,
you can see that happening in real
yeah,
time. That's crazy.
yeah.
So, those people who are left there, I mean, I've seen photos of children starving. Is it really that bad? Is that what's happening there?
So the military situation is no longer as bad, right?
Okay.
What is bad is the economic situation because
Mhm.
of kind of the pressure that's being put on the country and the lack of real governance in the country. The country is still fragmented. Nobody really runs the entire country. So people who have connections to the outside are tending to fare well.
Mm.
So if you have like
Gotcha.
cousins and things like that, people can
Send
send
the money.
remittances and it helps them
Yep.
out quite a bit. People who have no outside connections and no resource internally, yes, there's people starving to death in the country.
Wow. So, let's kind of, concentrate on what we can do. So what can we do as people on the outside, people who have we've seen this, kind of degenerate. And, it's honestly like in all the drama that's happened over the last, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 years, with our own political situation, with the, COVID-19, we've been very, consumed by that.
Hmm.
But now that you've kind of brought attention to this, what can we do to help?
Yeah,
Do
there's
you
two
have any
types of aid.
suggestions?
Well,
Yeah.
there's multiple types of aid, right? That I think are really important for the country right now. If I were to divide it up, I would say like it's three main themes, right? One is medical supplies. I
Okay.
spoke to a Yemeni heart surgeon who's telling me that they're reusing things that were disposable
Oh,
in surgeries. So if people have access to organizations or ways to be able to send like some basic things to the country, I think would be helpful
that's
for the
great.
country. Food supplies, direct like food aid. There's a few good organizations that are out there. Islamic Relief is doing a lot of good work in the country. They're on the ground because of the fact that they're an Islamic organization. They can move pretty freely around the country rather than maybe some of the other major NGOs that would have other concerns.
Gotcha.
And then the third thing is Yemen's actually a very fertile country. However, the reason that people are starving and they're having a hard time cultivating is because the usual way of drawing groundwater is by using pumps that are run on diesel fuel.
Okay.
and diesel's hard to come by. It's expensive, and there's months at a time where it's cut off. So I know
Wow.
people who are saying like we could grow our food, but we can't afford the diesel to grow our food. So organizations that do water works in Yemen, whether that's installing solar water pumps into these wells or helping with other forms of like water capturing efforts and things like that. I think
Gotcha.
that's a great way, and it's also my favorite way to help the country because it keeps their self-sufficiency up rather
I
than
love that.
relying on direct food aid from the outside.
I love that. I love that.
Mm.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I'm going to include some links at the end,
Sure.
we can, so that, people will be able to go directly and
Yeah.
provide some help. Okay. So not now to the not so serious part, a little bit lighthearted. Do you have your snack?
I
The
do.
snack it forward section of our show.
Yes.
You want to show us? Show us what it is. This is from Hannah Kang. This is her kind of favorite snack growing up. It's a seafood flavored chip. So now I know there's people who grow up on the coasts who love seafood. There's inland people like me who are just very afraid of seafood. So which camp do you fall into before we start?
I don't eat seafood at all, but I will do it for you. It's a
You are
seafood
awesome.
flavor, and so I'm going to do it for the production value of this show.
I've been waiting for a moment where somebody might not like the snack, but thank you, Hannah. I brought a bag myself. I was gonna actually join you in this, but I forgot it somewhere else. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
So you're on your own now. Let's. But this is I'm so judgmental. And there's nothing wrong with it. My kids love seaweed. They'll eat seaweed directly, and I'm like, wow, it looks like they really like it, and so I'll eat it. Like there must be something good. Maybe I'm like over exaggerating. It's like, oh my God, no, I just don't like it. It's funny how certain things are just not so universal. It's like really, if you grow up with it, you like it. If you don't,
everybody in my family eats seafood. I'm the only one. So
really, what happened? What happened to you?
I think it just wasn't forced on me as a kid, and I tend to be pretty simple in my tastes of food.
Gotcha.
So I just didn't fall into the rotation, and I refused to eat it after that. So
Okay. Oh, my assistant just brought.
Oh, good. Okay, so we're gonna
join you.
All
right. So much for the.
Should I eat it?
I thought I had reprieve. Hannah, This is for you. I smell the seafood. No, you're pretty good.
Not bad. I think the chip texture, the salt, kind of masks a lot of the seafood type of flavor.
It actually tastes really good.
Yeah.
I think the only thing that I don't like is the smell. Like when I
yeah.
But the taste is really good.
Yeah.
I think I might have found a new snack.
Cool.
Thank you, Hannah. So, what are you going to recommend? Like, what's your favorite snack then?
My favorite snack growing up was the Hostess chocolate cupcakes. Ones with little swirls on top.
Do you have it on you or no?
I don't have it on me.
That's okay. So, I think we've all seen that.
Yeah.
We
were running the store. He had a friend who would do the Hostess deliveries, and he would always let me get on the Hostess truck and grab one right out the truck. And just always, it's funny when you're 4 or 5 years old what memories stick with you. But I always loved those. I was very much into chocolate as a kid. I didn't like any of the kind of candy candies. It had to be like a cupcake or a cake or something along that line.
And what's amused me is like for everybody, it has to do. It's more than just the flavor of the snack.
Yeah.
It's what do they associate with the snack?
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you just shared. It's like when you're helping out with the store, the family business, right? You'd go out and they'd let you pick one right off the truck. There's those kind of like it's more about community and family and right those memories.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's incredible. So, well, thank you so much for being a part of this, for sharing your insights and your experience. I will definitely, like I said, I will definitely share the links on Facebook and YouTube when I post it. And thank you for joining us. God bless all your efforts in the future, and stay in touch. Hopefully we can bring you back for one of those other interesting aspects of your life.
Yeah, hopefully it won't be as interesting because it's not the kind of interesting I'm looking forward to for the rest of my life. So
Hopefully that's the climax. Hopefully
that's the
that's the most.
climax. Hopefully, yeah, exactly.
All right, man. Take care.
Thanks,
All right,
Jontie.
bye bye.
Take care.